Thank you for having me. Any conference that plays Nina Simone in the interlude, I'm totally here for. So I want to thank you for that. And I really want to try to bring some much needed, archival pushes for us to save everything that we're creating. And that's really the heart of what I want to discuss with this group today. This archival crisis that I'm going to talk about sometimes may seem like it's hyperbolic, but it's really not. And I hope to, within the next 20 minutes, really make a pitch for us to all be thinking about how we can be better archivists and how we can save a lot of the work and labor that we're putting into the largest social justice movement in American history. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. Let's see. All right. Can everyone see this? Thumbs up.
Yes,
thumbs
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. always a point of nervousness, even though we've been in this for a year. All right. And so I just wanted to direct everyone to the QR code in the corner. You can take a picture of that. This is actually a longer paper that I wrote on this very issue for the Social Science Research Council. And I am in this paper asking for social scientists and others who are adjacent to us, who care about us, who do this work, to be more thoughtful about the content that we save and to really put our money in our investments into providing spaces that are outside of social media platforms so that we can preserve this for future generations. And so if you just take a picture of that, the longer paper is available, but I'm distilling that paper down to you 20-minute presentation today for you today. So the first thing I think of when I think about an archival crisis is a process that I went through when I was writing this book, Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. And in it, I profiled 15 activists who were on the front lines of the very early Black Lives Matter movement, which seems so far away now in 2014. And I say 2014 and not the actual year that the hashtag was formed, because a lot of the groundswell of the hashtags that we started to curate occurred in 2014 at the Ferguson uprisings. And so Black Lives Matter as a hashtag peaked that year with 40 million tweets that were distilled into awesome studies all across the world. And during that time, though, I just kept thinking of the activists with their phones being unsafe. And while social scientists were very, very excited about the progress that we'd made in terms of being able to scrape big data and have these big data sets that we could dig into, I was more concerned about the small data. I was more concerned about what happens with this incendiary footage once it's in your phone and once the state knows that you have it. And so I kind of kicked that idea around. And as the book began to take shape, and as it was released 2 weeks before Mr. Floyd was killed, I, like the rest of you, watched the nation respond in various ways. And in my particular hometown of Washington, D.C., when these pictures popped up from mobile journalists, or mojos, as I like to call them, these are the last known photographs of a public appearance by Congressman John Lewis. And I look at a lot of images for my job, but something about this one really just sent me. I kind of lost it. I started crying when I saw it because I realized not only were we very close to losing an icon because he was very ill in this moment, but in the lower picture here on the left, I felt like he was almost begging us with his eyes to continue this work. And I thought about his hat that he chose to wear, the 1619 Project, and how he's creating this living arc of history for us to observe, from the recognition of slavery in his hat to his position just steps away from where he would have stood on the dais to give the I Have a Dream speech, to him looking down at the Black Lives Matter proclamation on this new plaza that the mayor established. And really, as I was looking at all of this, I couldn't help but think about his documentary, Good Trouble. And as he did eventually pass away in July, and I watched again all of the wonderful photography and the grainy footage that covered his life and his life's work, I was still stricken by the fact that somebody had to save that footage for us to be able to appreciate his life and for us to be able to appreciate all of the strides of the civil rights movement. It was an intentional preservation. We don't get shots like Bloody Sunday or him walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge years and years later without saving them. And so I came to this conclusion that tomorrow's archives are indeed built today. So when I look upon the face of Asa Philip Randolph here smiling, or Roy Wilkins Jr. smiling, or an unnamed African-American woman, as we often were back in the day, even though we were the backbone of the civil rights movement, as yet unnamed, I kept thinking about all of these images live in a place that are protected and safe. But tomorrow's archives are in jeopardy. And this is perhaps the most oxymoronic thing to think about, but we have more footage of every single mundane thing that happens in American human life, I should say, than at any other point in our history. Everybody is looking. Everybody has some kind of device to record just about. There are multiple vantage points, from surveillance on high in terms of police cameras, body cams, dash cams, and surveillance from below, which occurs from your cell phones. Yet it's disappearing at a rate of millions of videos every hour. And so to preserve mobile journalism, I encouraged last summer for my colleagues to start considering these 3 Ps that I'm going to talk about with you today. And each of us can pull off one of these 3 Ps and try our very best to be more thoughtful about how we save mobile journalism, and also pay homage to the people who are putting their bodies in harm's way to record it for us. And so many of you probably saw this footage from where I live now, my new hometown, LA. And you may have been looking at it in terms of awe. Wow, look at all of these people out here. You know, hundreds of thousands demonstrated in protest of Mr. George Floyd's killing last year. And as we look at it on loop and we think about just the sheer number of people who came out and braved the pandemic to do so, I think about it, though, as a journalism scholar. And I think all of these people probably had a cell phone. Yet, where are the stories? And so these 3 Ps will help us figure out where. These stories are precarious by nature and by design. And I say this because the people do not own the archive. For the first time, perhaps in American, I shouldn't say American, in the human race's history, we don't have intentional sites of memory. And so while intentional sites of memory like museums and libraries have always been sites of protest and have always been sites of colonial gazes, we now have a chance to correct that through the smartphone, and we have oppositional gazes or counter narratives that can be produced, yet they're trapped in our phones whose platforms we don't own, social media platforms that we don't own either. And quite frankly, these social media platforms have garnered a lopsided advantage over marginalized groups' content. And they have created platforms that disappear our content on purpose. So for Instagram Live, for Snapchat, for a lot of these ephemeral sites, it may be good for the social media company to not have to store the sheer volumes of footage, but it's bad for us as a people because we don't have a place that we can call our own to save this, that doesn't just disappear after 24 hours. And so the precarity that is inherent in these social media platforms that we trust is something that we must acknowledge regularly. I think that we have exalted far too long for the last couple of years the democratizing effects of a social media platform. And we've said, look, if we post Philando Castile's final moments on Facebook Live, for example, people will be awake. They will see what's going on. But we need only look to 1 month later when the same company, Facebook, made a decision to cut the feed of Corinne Gaines, who tried very desperately to record her final moments in a standoff with Baltimore police. And the body cams of those police officers were not on. And so she was shot in front of her 5-year-old son. And so when I look at those 2 case studies and I see in one case, Facebook made a decision to keep this up for posterity and for awareness, but yet to participate in the silencing of the voice of another. I think about how precarious we are as a people right now if we rely on social media only for this kind of witnessing. I also think that privacy is a new issue that's come to the fore. I opened with a talk about, mention of the civil rights movement, and I don't want to romanticize that at all. Many people who participated on the front lines of that were targeted at the highest levels of our government, right? There are declassified files, for example, of Dr. King and how much he was followed. And I think about the ordinary people, though, who would have been present at the March on Washington. If they're standing in a sea of people at the National Mall, they could have, by our modern standards, had a measure of anonymity. They could have gone home later and participated, maybe had their own personal archive, but they would have been relatively safe. Today, due to AI and facial recognition, this is no longer the case. As we've seen, there have been Black activists who have been targeted for participating on the very front lines. This came to the fore for me when I was doing a lot of my interviewing for the book, Bearing Witness While Black, because in the process of seeking out people who were on the front lines, we lost many people. There were 6 people in Ferguson, Black men, who were mysteriously killed. And they were the subjects of Pulitzer Prize winning photographs. They were on the covers of, magazines and on the top of the fold at the New York Times. And their privacy, because of being able to match very intricately who is who, became quite an issue. And so archiving has to be ethical. We can't just screen grab everything and say, oh no, we're going to lose it all. We've got to just, save it and not get permission or not think of at least the inherent risk that these folks are taking on the front lines. And this is where it gets complicated, because there's a lot of people right now who are working in these spaces who are coming up with tools to combat this. Stanford, for example, came up with a tool where they put a little fist emoji over someone's face automatically and counter that facial recognition with privacy. And so the real question is, do citizens have a right to be forgotten in this crusade to archive? That's something that we should be mulling over very carefully and studying with each other. Lastly, the last P of this whole formula is that the platforms themselves, if you haven't guessed already, are very opaque. They are problematic, and we need more transparency around them. Many of you who use Instagram and other ephemeral video sites may have seen this story is no longer available page. And this happens to me all the time as a researcher when I have students who love what I do, who want to send me things and say, Dr. Richardson, did you see this? And if I'm a minute late, I don't. I see this screen instead. And these platforms, they're very clear about, sure, you've got 24 hours to see that, and that's out in the open. But what they're not transparent about is how their shadow banning process works. And both Instagram and TikTok admitted this summer that they did silence Black voices algorithmically, not even on a case-by-case basis, but used hashtags like Black Lives Matter or Justice for George Floyd to shadow ban high-profile users so that their content could not even be seen to save. And so we need more longitudinal studies of this kind that really delve into what are the practices and policies that are inherent at these companies that would deign to make quiet Black and brown voices. And this is especially important when we see now that they can decide when they want to intervene and when they don't. For example, on January 6th, when we saw our former president tweeting about the insurrection and being in support of it, he was finally, at last, banned from the site, deplatformed. But Black and brown activists are deplatformed every single day. And he had said things for years and years and years and years that put many people in harm's way, that endangered many citizens, that were patently false, that were racist, and remained on the site. And so when you look at those and you juxtapose when these sites get to make these decisions about who is seen and who is not, again, we realize that we have a real crisis. And so to recap, the things that we should be thinking about as we think about saving social justice media and mobile media in general is that we have to consider that we do not own the archives that we are trusting right now. So we must develop new ones. We need intentional sites of memory. We need innovative ways to save things. We need our tried and true institutions like museums and libraries to become more innovative and to become safe spaces for saving this stuff. We also need a consideration of privacy for those activists who do not wish to participate. People should have a chance to opt in or out, because in some of these cities, it could mean state-sponsored harassment later on or their life. Lastly, we should be considering the platforms themselves and interrogating them more deeply, and not just a cursory look at their practices through someone very high up giving a congressional testimony that no one understands. We need to really have funded research that digs into and picks apart these black boxes and opens them up to see who was banned, when, and why. And then that accountability piece can come in. And so, as I know I'm unlimited time, I'd just like to dedicate this presentation to just a few of the names that we've heard this week that have given such a heavy weight to the work that we do here. Adam Toledo is no longer with us. He's a 13-year-old out of Chicago who died at the hands of police. Dante Wright, 20-year-old young man, died at the hands of police. George Floyd, the Chauvin trial is ongoing, and we're waiting with bated breath to see, as a nation, what's going to happen in terms of the sentencing, if there is going to be any kind of sentencing. And lastly, we celebrate that Lieutenant Karan Nazario is still here, that he can still testify and tell us what happened, even though he was in uniform and peacefully, calmly trying to explain to police why he pulled into a well-lit area to comply with them eventually. And so just those four names, and we could go on and on and on with names, require us to resist as social scientists, resist the urge to trust social media sites as your only place of saving things, because they're not, quite frankly, to be trusted, and reimagine what archivism looks like, make it popular, make it sexy, fund it, trust it, believe it, engage in a practice of it, even if you're not an archivist. Save it for future generations so that one day we can do what John Lewis did for us, and that's give us a retrospective so that we know how far we've come and how far we have yet to go. Thank you.
Dr. Richardson, thank you so much for sharing with us. We do have a couple questions coming in from the audience. Let's see, the first one is, what would a futuristic, mindful community archiving process look like, and how can it also protect from a hyper-vigilant state?
I love this question. I actually participated in one of these this year. I worked with a company called GRX Laboratories, and it's a Black-owned extended reality company that reached out to me when they heard me talking about this on the news here in LA. And we did a 4-city docu-series where we archived the protests. It's called In Protest, and I can drop the link in the chat for you all. But we visited Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Los Angeles, and we covered the good, the bad. We balanced it out, and we made sure that we asked permission for the people who actually did want to be on camera. And it lives in non-traditional places now. It's being shown in museums. It was purchased by Oculus. And so it's a way of us making sure that we are selling content back to these platforms to let them know this is how we would like to be archived. We don't want it to just live with you. We want to create it and save it, and you can borrow it, but we ultimately own it because we are the people who gathered it. And so while I'm not calling for a wholesale ban of social media, that'll never happen. People want to be on these sites and they want to participate. What we can at least do is bring this archive to them and make sure that it endures. So that's just one model that I've seen. I've also seen lots of libraries becoming community spaces of activist archivism. And so they are actually at the local library level saving a lot of these in protected spaces. So whether it's creating redundancy on various hard drives that only certain people have access to password-wise, or making sure that certain activists remain anonymous when they want to come forward with something in the community that they've seen the police do. I've seen libraries take an outsized role in this now to save and protect the community in the process. So it's going to call for a full-scale reimagining of not relying on just social media and networks.
Well, thank you so much for that response. Another question is, do you have a sense of how often Black and Brown media users or activists are deplatformed?
Yes, I think that this summer, by their own hand, Instagram and TikTok admitted that it was an algorithmic formula that they used. So it could have been millions of users. Anyone who on Blackout Tuesday, which was June 2nd of last year, who was using a Blackout Tuesday hashtag got allowed to stay up. But if you had Black Lives Matter or Justice for George Floyd in the hashtag thread as well, that was blocked. And so a lot of people could not see their tweets. They could not see their posts. They were just like, what's going on? On Twitter, too, I should mention that there were bans of Black users who are blue check verified last year as well. Many of us logged on and we were like, why can't we post anything? What's happening? And we put two and two together and realized that all blue check verified Black folks were being banned for a time. And so that went on for about a day or two. And we don't know why. We still don't know. They apologized for it, but we have no idea the scale, which is why I was calling for, in that last P, more transparency about how many people this affects.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of like a follow-up question almost, like that seems to be like on the end of the social media platforms, like what they need to be doing. But then someone asked, like, what can we do on an individual or small scale to help the archival process?
Absolutely. I would say save everything you have and start a family archive at the smallest unit, and then a community archive at the next level up, especially if you're heavily engaged in community activities. Right now, I'm working with a lot of groups to make sure that they're saving here in LA what they're doing. Groups like the Compton Cowboys, for example, led a huge voter registration, and they had a huge march throughout the city of Compton to make sure everybody voted last year. And we documented that through our 360 cams and drone cams and gave it to them and made sure that they had that so that they could save it and say, this is some of the contributions that we made. So I think that everybody doing this on a nuclear level, making sure that they're saving that for themselves, ensures that we have it for the future, not just for a counter narrative, but for the future journalistic newsreel. And as we're needed, we can turn that over to museums and we can turn it over to libraries if we need to. But eventually, we need to be thinking about creating our own platforms for sharing this that are independent of the big three.
I think even another follow-up question to that was someone asked, so when we are creating those like individual archives, when we are like recording those events, should we be asking, like us as citizen archivists, should we be asking before we archive the events in the public space, especially considering like what you were talking about, the danger that these activists have encountered because of like the publicity they've garnered due to their activism?
Absolutely. I think if you're going to capture someone's sign and you're going to really be in their face, there has to be a conversation. And I always pick on my own folks, on journalists for doing this. We often snap pictures and we leave. We don't even ask the person's name, ask for a phone number to follow up later on. And so the same measure of, just human decency, asking someone, what is your name? Or may I see your sign? Or can I take a picture of your sign? And then asking their name is very valuable, especially if it's a very emotional moment. If someone's mid yell, mid scream, tears are streaming down their face, it's essential to attach humanity to that.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there, and unfortunately there are more questions than we have time for, but we have breakout rooms after this. Is there and should there be a royalties process for those whose content is redistributed on the internet? For instance, this person said they were thinking about folks seen in those popular group activist pictures.
I absolutely think there should be a royalties process for the person who recorded it. And that is one of my biggest gripes with citizen journalism, is that if we think about the Zapruder film, for example, which is one of our very first instances of somebody catching something ghastly on film, that was the man who recorded President Kennedy being assassinated. His family is still compensated for that footage every day, every time it's used. Same thing with George Holliday, who recorded the Rodney King video. He was compensated for a time when it looped on television. And so the least we can do, I think, is start to compensate some of these citizen journalists for the ghastly things that they've seen. And I'm thinking specifically of Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old who recorded George Floyd's last moments. I'd love to see some compensation for her so that she can make sure that she's getting the proper mental health care and that she can be taken care of in terms of going to college if she chooses to do so. Because it can be very difficult to perform well academically after that, to be competitive for a college admission, let alone qualify for scholarships and all of these things. So I think of the ripple effect of looking, and I think definitely it should be compensated.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Richardson, for such an incredible talk and also for answering all these questions. There were more, again, so many interesting points made we just don't have time for currently. And thank you to everyone who shared a thought or question.